In a forgotten corner of the world, wrapped in mountains and mist, stood a kingdom under a silent spell. It was not silence of peace, but one of fear, secrets, and power. Queen Malvora ruled this land with an iron gaze and a heart sealed by bitterness. They said her beauty once rivaled the stars, but something had turned her cold. Her voice was a command, her smile a warning, and her laughter rare and cruel always meant someone else's sorrow. At the center of her palace, behind silver gates and guarded dreams, lived her daughter, Princess Elira. She was a woman of stillness, not by choice, but by curse. Her voice had been taken when she was a child, replaced by an unspoken sadness that lived in her eyes. Elira had never known freedom. For years, princes from across the seas came to win her hand, drawn by stories of her beauty, her stillness, her mystery. Yet none returned. Each was given a task by the Queen Impossible, unforgiving, and when they failed, they vanished into silence, like dust under a closed door. The people whispered of the Blood Garden, where crimson roses bloomed unnaturally bright. Some said those roses grew where the princes had fallen, their stories buried beneath petals. But no one dared speak too loudly. No one dared question the queen. Far beyond this kingdom, in a village where the sun painted roofs in gold every morning, lived a boy named Oral. His home was not made of stone and guards, but of firewood, bread, and stories passed down by old hands. His father was once a king, long ago, but now wore a farmer's boots and a tired smile. They had little just enough for soup, warmth, and songs by the fire, but Oral grew with a hunger that food could not touch. One night, Oral dreamed. He saw a cage of crystal, floating above a river of stars, and inside, a girl with silver tears on her cheeks. She did not speak, but her eyes reached for him like a question with no end. When he woke, her face stayed in his mind, like the scent of something he had never touched. He did not know her name, but he knew her sadness. When Oral heard the tale of Princess Elira and the cruel trials of Queen Malvora, his heart beat louder than reason. "She is the one," he told his father. "The girl in my dream. I must go to her." His father, old and worn by the weight of time, shook his head. "Son, dreams are not paths, and that queen's heart is a blade. Many have tried. None returned. You are all I have." But Oral could not rest. He stopped singing. He stopped eating. His laughter turned quiet. One morning, his father placed a rough hand on his shoulder. "Go then. If love lives in your dream, perhaps it will guide you better than fear ever could." Oral smiled for the first time in weeks. He packed no gold. He wore no crown. His armor was his heart, his hope, and a name he barely understood himself. Before he left, he whispered to the sky, "Elira, I will find you, and I will not let you disappear." What made Oral different was not power. It was not strength. It was the way he looked at the world not as something to conquer, but as something worth listening to. He did not ride a great horse. He walked. Through forests that forgot their own names, past rivers that hummed lullabies. His journey began with silence, but not the same silence that haunted Elira. His was the silence of wonder, of watching, of waiting. He helped an old woman carry water in exchange for a story. He fixed a child's broken cart and learned a new song. Every step he took was not a step toward a prize, but a thread weaving him into a world larger than his dream. He did not yet know that he would meet 5 strangers whose powers were unlike anything in the stories he had grown up with. He did not know that their loyalty would be tested, or that Queen Malvora's games were far darker than he imagined. All he knew was that somewhere, a girl was waiting not for a hero, but for someone who truly saw her, and he would not let her wait forever. Oral's journey unfolded not with the thunder of marching soldiers, but with the soft rhythm of footsteps pressed into forgotten soil. With every mile, he left behind the world of comfort and certainty, moving deeper into places where maps ended and stories began. The sun became his only companion, and the quiet rustle of trees, his conversation. Yet within that quiet, something was growing an unseen thread, pulling him towards something greater than a princess behind a gate. Something unspoken was calling out to the most human parts of him, his longing, his courage, and his capacity to trust strangers. He first encountered Gusto beneath the wide belly of a hill that looked, from a distance, like a sleeping beast. At its base lay what Oral mistook for a boulder, until the rock groaned and turned, revealing a man of staggering size and sleepy eyes. Gusto stretched his arms like a giant waking from a 100-year nap and blinked at Oral. "Do you always walk so loudly?" he muttered. I didn't think I was," Oral replied, startled. "Ah," said Gusto, rubbing his stomach. "Then it must be my hunger talking." Gusto, it turned out, had an appetite that defied belief. That morning alone he had eaten 7 loaves of bread, a full ham, and 3 jars of honey, yet his hunger never dulled his spirit. He spoke in poetic phrases, often comparing food to life and memory. "Every flavor is a story," he would say, "and I've been hungry for meaning." When Oral asked him to join the quest, Gusto did not hesitate. "If your heart's real and the food's honest, I'll follow you anywhere." A day later, near a ravine laced with fog, Oral met Okoa's slender man crouching low, his ear pressed to the earth like he was listening to the whispers of the dead. His other ear, enormous and shell-shaped, glistened in the morning light. Echo didn't look up when Oral approached. "I can hear you thinking," he said quietly. "Your thoughts are soft, but they tremble with questions." Oral knelt beside him, unsure whether to speak aloud. Echo finally turned, his eyes lined with years of sleepless listening. "I don't hear what people say," he explained. "I hear what they mean." Echo had spent much of his life trying to escape the noise of the world. But when Oral told him of Elira, the silence she carried, of the dream that brought him here, something shifted in Echo's expression. "A voice that's been stolen," he whispered, "often screams the loudest. I'll help you find her." Soon after, in a valley lined with crooked trees, Oral and his new companions stumbled upon 2 limbs stretched far across the road like fallen tree trunks. They were arms massive, muscular, and impossibly long. Following them back, the trio discovered a man wedged awkwardly between rocks, his face serene despite the absurdity of his position. "My name is Reach," he said calmly, as if reclining in a velvet chair. "You may not believe this, but I'm still growing." Oral asked why he was there, tangled and still. Reach smiled. "I've spent years reaching for things no one could see, stars, dreams, forgotten truths. I stopped moving so my heart could stretch farther than my limbs." The words struck Oral deeply. This man had spent a lifetime extending himself for the impossible, and now here he was, ready to stretch again for something worthy. "If you believe in something far away," Reach said, standing tall with effort, "I'll help bring it closer." Later that evening, as twilight painted the world in bruised purple, they met Vision. He stood still at the edge of a cliff, one hand covering his left eye. The other eye, sharp, silver, and strange, seemed to shimmer with distant galaxies. "Are you watching the stars?" Oral asked. "No," Vision replied. "I'm watching a man sleep inside a prison 2 mountains from here. I can see everything, everywhere. That's why I cover my eye to keep myself in the present." He turned to Oral, his gaze quiet but overwhelming. "You're searching for someone who's forgotten how to cry." "How do you know that?" Oral whispered. Vision didn't answer directly. "Your dream wasn't a dream. It was her memory." Without another word, Vision stepped down and joined the group. The growing bond between these unlikely travelers was not built on history or loyalty, but on the invisible thread of shared ache, and the belief that sometimes strangers can hold the missing pieces of our journey. On the 5th day, cold rain began to fall. The clouds thickened like grief, and the wind stung their cheeks. That's when they saw a figure sitting under a tree, wrapped in 2 thick coats, his breath fogging the air, though the weather was not yet cold. His name was Frost. Frost didn't shiver. He never did. "Cold lives inside me," he said, his voice slow and deep. "When I open my coat, winter comes. When I close it, summer returns." "Why would someone carry winter inside them?" Oral asked, curious, not afraid. Frost looked up, his eyes blue and unreadable. "Once, I lost something I loved. The world stayed warm, but I didn't. So now I keep the cold with me, just in case warmth ever becomes too dangerous." He didn't offer to join, but when Oral spoke of Elira, not as a prize to be claimed, but a soul to be seen, Frost quietly stood and followed. He didn't need to say yes. His steps said it for him. And so, Oral continued, not alone, but with 5 strange hearts beside him. They were not knights. They were not warriors. They were broken pieces of the world, walking toward a palace that had broken many before them. Each carried something unexplainable, something impossible. But they also carried the most human thing of Allah choice. Not one of them had been asked to be a hero. But now, in Oral's presence, they were choosing to become one. And together, they walked on. The gates of Queen Malvora's city loomed like a mouth that had swallowed too many dreams. Jagged towers pierced the sky, their shadows long and cold even under the sun. As Oral and his 5 companions crossed the threshold, a hush fell over the city square. People watched from windows, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and wonder. They had seen princes arrive before bold, proud, armored in wealth and arrogance, but never a boy with empty pockets and a full heart, never a procession of misfits whose gifts were stitched with mystery and pain. Queen Malvora waited in her throne room, carved from obsidian and mirrors. Her presence was sharp, like the final note of a song no one dares hum. Oral stepped forward without hesitation. "I've come for Elira," he said. His voice was steady, not loud, but it cut through the silence like a key through ice. Malvora studied him. "Then you must prove yourself," she replied, her lips curling at the edges. "There are 3 tasks. Complete them, and you may see the girl. Fail, and the world will forget your name." Oral bowed his head. "Then let us begin." That night, the queen's voice echoed through the marble halls. "A jewel has fallen from my crown, a sapphire blessed by the sea itself. It lies at the bottom of the river Vire, where light does not reach. Bring it to me before the sun sets tomorrow." No map was offered, no direction, just the weight of time ticking down. By morning, they reached the banks of the river. The water moved like molten glass deep, silent, endless. Oral looked at his companions. No one spoke. There was no panic, only trust. Vision uncovered his left eye, that glowing window to the far and hidden. He stared into the depths. "I see it, beneath a rock, 40 paces from shore, but it's guarded." "Guarded by what?" Oral asked. "A memory," Vision whispered. "A living shadow made from drowned sorrow. It only attacks what fears it." They all turned to Gusto, who was already rolling up his sleeves. "I don't fear hunger, shadows, or queens," he said with a grin. Then, without ceremony, he bent over and began to drink. The river lowered, inch by inch, until its bed was exposed. Oral had never seen anything like its stones, shaped like broken hearts, weeds that whispered with every gust. And there, shimmering between cracks, was the sapphire. Reach stepped forward, his arms stretched like branches toward the jewel. The shadow began to rise, ink and anguish twisting into a form. But Reach didn't stop. He spoke softly as he reached words about a childhood dream, about stretching for stars he never thought he'd touch. The shadow paused, flickered, and vanished. The sapphire landed gently in his palm. They returned before sundown, and Oral placed the gem in Malvora's hand. She didn't smile. She simply said, "Tomorrow, I will ask for something even more nourishing." The next day began with a feast, but not for Oral. 30 cakes sat on a long silver table, surrounded by guards. "Eat them all," Malvora ordered, "before the tower bell rings at noon, and not a crumb must remain." Oral looked at the mountain of food, then at his friends. He raised a hand. "May I invite a guest? I never dine alone." Malvora raised an eyebrow. "Only one." Gusto stepped forward, bowed low, and whispered to the cakes, "Forgive me, sweet ones." The guards watched with amusement at first, then awe, then fear. One by one, the cakes disappeared, as did the fruit platters, the side dishes, the garnishes, and even the tablecloth. By the time the bell rang, Gusto had licked the silver clean and asked, quite politely, if dessert was coming. Malvora said nothing. Her fingers clenched the edges of her throne. Her eyes narrowed, but her lips curled again this time, into something darker. "You've eaten, you've retrieved, but can you stay awake in the presence of dreams?" That night, she invited Oral to dine with her and Elira. The princess was brought in her steps slow, her eyes distant, her voice still stolen. She wore a gown like melted moonlight. Oral's heart broke, just watching her. They dined in, near silence. The food sparkled with strange flavors, the wine perfumed with spice and sleep. At one point, Malvora leaned close and whispered, "Careful, you've come so far, but the hardest part is staying present." Later, she led Oral to the highest tower, where he was told to sit with Elira for 2 hours. "Stay awake," she warned. "If you fall asleep, she will vanish, and so will your soul." As the doors shut behind them, Elira turned to him, her gaze searching. She could not speak, but her presence was not silent. Her emotions rippled like light on water. She smiled with her eyes, and Oral spoke of his journey, of Gusto's poetry, Echo's gift, Reach's patience, Vision's truth, and Frost's sorrow. But his words grew heavy. His eyelids faltered. Something unseen was pulling him down like a lullaby meant to end him. He reached out and took Elira's hand, and for a moment, the world flickered. Still, the magic worked. Oral drifted into a sudden sleep. When he woke, the tower was dim. The chair beside him was empty. "She's gone," he whispered, stumbling to the window. Far below, he saw Echo standing still, one ear pressed to the ground. Oral shouted, and the man looked up. "She's calling," Echo said, "from across the river, trapped, inside a tree, hidden by the Queen's men." The others were already moving. Vision confirmed it. Reach readied his arms. But the river was wild again, flowing fast and cruel. Then Frost stepped forward. "No one can cross that," Reach said. "Not in time." Frost looked to Oral. "Then it's time I open my coat." And as he did, winter arrived. When Frost opened his coat, the world shuddered. The warmth of late evening vanished in an instant, as snow began to fall from a sky that had been clear just moments before. The river, wild and untamable only seconds ago, began to freeze, first at its edges, then inch by inch across its surface, until the rushing water stilled into a mirror of pale silver. Trees trembled beneath the sudden weight of winter, and silence deep and sacred wrapped itself around the land. Oral stood in awe. Around him, his companions sprang into action without a word. Reach extended his arms, lifting Oral and Elira's empty cloak gently across the river. They moved swiftly over the ice, no hesitation in their steps, no fear in their hearts. The cold cut into their skin, but they were beyond pain, now fueled by urgency, by purpose, by the knowledge that what they sought was not a crown or a prize, but a soul worth saving. Across the frozen water, beneath the shadow of skeletal trees, stood the twisted trunk of an ancient tree. Vision pointed. She's inside, buried in its heart. Oral approached, laying his hand gently on the bark. "Elira," he whispered. "I'm here." The tree pulsed beneath his fingers, not with magic, but with something older anguish turned into wood, memory turned into prison. Echo stepped forward, his ear to the roots, listening not for sound, but for story. "She's dreaming," he said. "She thinks no one's coming." "We're here," Oral said, his voice steady, "and we are not leaving without her." Reach wrapped his arms around the trunk, and slowly, with the care of someone embracing an old friend, pulled. The bark cracked like bones learning to open again. Light spilled from the core of the tree, pale and soft. And then, like snow melting beneath the first touch of spring, Elira stepped forward, her body trembling, her eyes wide. She had not spoken in years, but in that moment, her gaze said more than any words. Her hand found Oral's, and something passed between thema recognition, a return, a remembering. He did not ask if she was all right. He simply held her, and that was enough. They hurried back across the ice, the sky darkening. Frost's breath grew labored, his skin paling under the weight of the storm he carried. When they reached the other side, he stumbled. "I can't hold it much longer," he said softly. "Then don't," Oral replied, wrapping Frost's coat back around him. As the fabric closed, the air warmed. The river cracked and roared to life behind them, but Elira was safe, and so was Frost. They returned to the tower, sneaking Elira back into the same high room from which she had disappeared. Long arms lifted her through the window, placing her gently on the cushions. Oral climbed in after her. Outside, snow still kissed the garden. Inside, everything was as it had been, except now. Elira was awake, free, and her silence no longer helpless. Moments later, the door creaked open. Queen Malvora entered, her smile prepared, her victory assumed. But her eyes caught on the two figures by the window, Oral awake and watchful, and Elira alive and present. The queen did not speak at first. Her silence was jagged, sharp enough to cut stone. Then she offered a smile colder than Frost's breath. "How lovely," she murmured. "You're having quite the conversation." Oral met her gaze. "We're speaking of trees and rivers," he said, voice calm, "of how some things bend and others break." The queen's eyes flickered with something unreadable. That night, she offered Oral a room in the palace. "Your servants may rest too," she said sweetly. "They must be very tired." He knew it was a trap, but nodded politely. As he and his companions were led to a grand chamber beneath the queen's private quarters, Elira reached for his hand. Her fingers trembled. "I'll return," he whispered. The room was beautiful golden beds, thick carpets, velvet chairs, but beneath its floor burned something cruel. Oral heard it first as a distant hum. Then Echo sat up, alarmed. "Something's alive beneath us," he said. "Not a person, a fire." Moments later, the walls began to warm. The ceiling above grew hazy with heat. Gusto pressed a hand to the floor and winced. "She's trying to cook us," he muttered. "This is her final test." The queen had commanded the palace cooks to build a great fire in the depths, directly below their room. The heat swelled with each breath until the air turned into iron, pressing against their lungs. The door would not open. The windows were sealed shut. "This is how it ends," Reach said quietly. "Not with swords, with slow death." Oral turned to Frost. "We need you." Frost shook his head. If I open my coat here, the palace will freeze." "Then let it freeze," Oral answered. Frost opened his coat. Winter slammed into the room like a wave of stars. Ice bloomed across the walls. Curtains turned to snow. Gusto curled into himself, shaking. Echo's voice cracked as he muttered the memories of summer. Vision closed his eyes and saw warmth slipping away. The room became a frozen tomb. Then Oral did something unexpected. He reached out and removed Frost's coat himself. "Let me carry it," he said, "just for a moment." The coat, heavy with sorrow, fell around his shoulders. Instantly, snow poured from his sleeves. His lips turned blue, but the others began to thaw, their strength returning. Gusto's breath became visible again. Reach stood. Vision opened his eyes. Frost, now wrapped in Oral's own cloak, nodded slowly. The queen, listening at the door, heard nothing. She smiled. "They're finished," she said. She flung the door open, ready to see ash and ruin. Instead, 6 figures stood tall beneath a ceiling of frost and moonlight. Elira's voice, barely audible from the tower above, spoke the first words she had said in years. "They are not broken." Malvora stood frozen in the doorway. Oral stepped forward, the coat still around his shoulders. "You tried to bury us in silence and fire," he said, "but some hearts are louder than fear." The queen didn't reply. Her lips moved, but no sound came. For the first time, she seemed smallest in the very silence she had forced on others. And outside, for the first time in a generation, the palace bells began to ring. The morning after the frost had broken the queen's final trap, the palace stood still. Not in fear, but in the unfamiliar hush that follows a storm. Snow still clung to the window panes, refusing to melt, as though winter itself wanted to bear witness to what would come next. The people in the city, having seen the lights and heard the distant clash of cold and fire, gathered in quiet clusters, watching the tower from afar. Something had shifted. They could feel it. Inside, Oral stood at the threshold of the throne room once more. This time, he held no fear, no request, no armor of hope. Elira walked beside him, her presence no longer a mystery, but a steady pulse of light. She still had not spoken much, not with words, but her voice had returned in the way she moved, the way she held herself, the way her silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like music waiting to be heard. Queen Malvora sat slouched on her obsidian throne. Her eyes, once sharp and predatory, were now dimmed by something far more human recognition. Oral approached, and for the first time, he noticed the lines around her eyes, not drawn by cruelty, but by grief. This was not the face of a monster, but of a woman held hostage by her own past. "Why?" Oral asked gently. "Why destroy every man who tried to love her?" Malvora didn't look up. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper lost in smoke. "Because love once came with lies. I gave my heart once to a man who promised the sky. He left with my voice and gave it to another. I thought if I could control everything, no one would ever leave again." She looked at Elira then. For the first time in many years, something like regret softened her face. "I took your voice," she confessed. "Not to punish you, but to keep you safe from the world I no longer trusted." Elira stepped forward. Her eyes glistened, but she did not weep. Slowly, she reached for her mother's hand. For a long moment, she simply held it. Then, her voice returned not in grandeur or triumph, but in quiet truth. "I'm still here," she said, "but I cannot stay in a kingdom built on fear." Those words, simple and soft, echoed louder than any command Malvora had ever spoken. Oral turned to the queen. "You don't have to rule this way. Power doesn't have to be control. It can be presence, kindness, choice." Malvora said nothing, but she did not stop them when they turned to leave. And so they left the palace, not with an army, not with riches, but with something far more rare: freedom. Word spread quickly through the city. The silent princess had spoken. The trials were over. The queen, once feared like a storm, did not pursue. In the weeks that followed, Oral and Elira did not return to the village, nor did they stay in the palace. Instead, they found a place beyond both a hill, where the sun always touched the grass first, and the wind carried no judgment. There, they built something new, not a castle, but a sanctuary. People came from distant lands not to bow, not to fight, but to learn. They called it the School of the Brave Heart. It wasn't a school in the ordinary sense. There were no tests, no titles. Only stories shared, meals passed hand to hand, and languages of the heart spoken fluently for the first time. Gusto taught poetry through the rhythm of chewing how to taste words and flavors at once. Echo helped children listen not just to voices, but to what was hidden beneath them. Reach guided those afraid to dream, showing them how far a hand could go when it was reaching for something true. Vision opened minds with paintings of places not yet visited, and Frost, with quiet reverence, taught them how to sit in sadness without becoming it. Oral and Elira walked among them, not as rulers, but as reminders that courage does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes it is just the decision to stay awake when the world wants you to fall asleep. One day, a young girl asked Elira, "How did you get your voice back?" Elira knelt beside her and smiled. "I never lost it," she said. "I just needed someone who believed I was worth hearing." The girl nodded and wrote those words into the dirt beside her. Years passed. The hill bloomed with laughter and languages. The school became legend, not because it trained warriors, but because it helped people become more whole. And though Queen Malvora was never seen again, some say she once visited in disguise an old woman who sat at the edge of a garden, listening to a child read her story out loud. No one asked her name. They only asked her to stay. And so, in a world once ruled by silence and fear, there grew a new kingdom, where bravery meant being soft, being seen, and being willing to love without control. A kingdom that didn't need a crown, only a heart that stayed open. Oral and Elira never spoke of destiny. They simply lived it, together. This story reminds us that true strength lies not in power, but in empathy, resilience, and the courage to see others deeply. Every voice matters, even the quiet ones. Every journey begins with belief. If this touched your heart and helped you learn English through emotion and context, subscribe now and support the channel. Your encouragement fuels the next inspiring lesson. Let's grow together, one story at a time.